What's up guys, it's River and today we're looking at the Canon 90D. This is a phenomenal photo and video camera. So today we're gonna look at how to properly set it up so that you can get the most out of your camera and stand out from your competition. Without further ado, let's get into it. And before we jump into the video, I just quickly want to say thank you so much for all the wonderful comments I've been getting lately. They honestly make my day. Any products we talk about will be in the description down below, so be sure to check that out. And without further ado, let's get right into it. All right guys, so let's jump right into it. The first thing we're gonna do is how to set up photo mode in this camera properly so that you get the most out of it. So the first thing you want to do is you want to flip this switch to either video or photo. Once you're in photo, you're really just gonna be able to do photos. Once you're in video, you'll just be able to do video. And if you hit this button right here, it'll go into live screen mode. And if you hit that same button in video mode, it'll start recording. So you wanna make sure you're in photo mode and that if you're trying to do photos, make sure you're in photo mode. Pretty self-explanatory. All right guys, so the first thing you wanna do is you wanna go into your menu, just hit the menu button, and right there your main photo menu should pop up. So the first thing you're gonna go into is image quality. Now in image quality, the first thing you'll see is RAW versus C-RAW. RAW is just straight up uncompressed RAW, and C-RAW is compressed RAW. I would only really shoot compressed RAW if I needed the space, maybe if I was shooting on a small card, or if I was traveling and I was short on hard drive space, but generally I always recommend shooting RAW. I find often with C-RAW, some computers are a bit slower because it takes it time to uncompress the RAW and then process it. I have a MacBook with a dedicated graphics card, but it is from 2017, I think now. So I wouldn't say my MacBook is old, but it's not the newest, and it does tend to struggle a bit with specifically C-RAW. So be wary of that, but if you've got a baller 2018, 2019 MacBook, then you know, you're cooler than me. All right guys, so if you look underneath RAW, you'll see JPEG. And now JPEG comes in a bunch of different flavors, large, medium, small. And now large, you'll get the full 32 megapixel depth, or sorry, the full 32 megapixel resolution, so you'll get a 6K image. Medium, you'll get 15. And small, you'll get 8.1, which is really just cell phone quality. And now JPEG is interesting because I know some photographers that exclusively shoot in JPEG, they're like, I don't even need RAW, I know what I'm doing with everything, and you know, those guys are G's. I always shoot in RAW. I'm in love with the format of RAW. But right next to L, M, and S, you'll actually see like a little staircase or a little like fine. So basically, this is like regular and fine. I find fine has more detail and holds up better. It's a bit more data, but it's not substantial enough for it to really be that big of a deal. But what I would really recommend doing is always shooting just the fine, which is the curve, because often what I find is that there isn't really that much of a data difference that I'm saving that much space, so I'd rather just get the best JPEG that I possibly can. Always shoot large because JPEGs really don't take up that much space. Unless these are just throwaway test photos, always shoot large. That's my recommendation. So in this particular case, we're gonna go with RAW and large JPEG, and that's usually what most of you guys are gonna be shooting. You'll be shooting RAW images and then sending out large JPEGs to your editor or like just sharing it with your clients. But at the same time, if you're just working by yourself, I would probably recommend just shooting RAW for yourself and then just shooting like small JPEGs just to share with the client, just so they can see what they're getting. And also I like sending clients small JPEGs because this way they can never just take it and then run away with my photos, if anyone has experience with that. So the next thing I want to talk about is slightly controversial, but I promise you this is the right way of doing it. I want to talk about picture styles. So basically, if you go into camera menu 3, you'll see picture style, and you'll see that there's a bunch of options available to you, like auto, standard, portrait, yada, yada, yada. Most of this will not make a difference, but know that a lot of this data will be thrown away when you go into RAW. And a lot of people think that you can shoot Sony RAW, Canon RAW, and it doesn't really make a difference. And this is where I tend to disagree with people. Canon RAW does not look the same as Sony RAW. You can definitely manipulate the colors to look like whatever you want, but not all RAW is the same. The color science is fundamentally different in the camera. So when it comes to this, whatever picture style you pick is what will show up in your JPEG, is the look that'll be baked into your JPEGs. and is also the look that will, but it won't be, but that look will not be baked into your raw photos. You'll kind of get a very neutral raw photo. So what I usually like to do is pick the picture style that most closely defines the look that I'm gonna get, bake that into the JPEG so I remember what look I was going for, and then just kind of try to mimic it or try to just remember what I want to put into the raw photos. But I really feel like setting up your picture style initially is very, very, very important. So we're gonna quickly set up a picture style just so you guys can kind of see how to do it. So what I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna make my own picture style here. I'm gonna go into Faithful, Info, and what I'm actually gonna do is, depending on what I wanna do, I can turn the sharpness all the way up, or the finesse, fineness, which is like the texture of it, all the way up or down, threshold, contrast. I have all these options, and it's really important to like just kind of sit around, use it to play around with the look that I want to get, and figure that out. I really think everyone should be going into picture styles and kind of using picture styles to help them create a look. The reason I like using picture styles is that it just really helps you figure out exactly what look you're going for and stick to your vision all the way through. I've seen a lot of photographers that kind of just shoot whatever they want for fashion and portraits and then try to create a look for it in RAW in Lightroom later, and it just isn't the best work. I always recommend having a vision, sticking to it. And once you have your image quality set up, the next thing I want to talk about is autofocus, because once you have your subject set up, you've got to make sure you're capturing them sharp and in focus. So the best way I like to get to this menu is I like to hit the live screen button, which is a little knob between video and photo mode. Once you're there, your live screen should turn on. And from there, I like to hit the Q button, and from there, you'll see that all your quick menus come up. Now, there's a couple ways of doing it. So for photo, you'll see one shot or servo. You always want to make sure it's in servo. That means it's constantly, focusing on moving objects. And then right here, you'll see a bunch of different modes. So there's like zone AF, which it picks different zones in your sensor. 1 point where it just picks a single focus point, and then just like once you half press, that's the point, and you can even move your camera around, but it won't track to different points. That's really more for like still life, maybe like portraits, I would say. Let me open up this menu again. And then right here, you'll see Spot AF, where it just takes a small area and just focuses on that. What I like to do is I like to always use face tracking and subject tracking. One, because it allows me to do touch autofocus, and B, I shoot a lot of people, so it constantly tracks faces for me. I find this is the most effective, and it's also like the smartest autofocus mode. And then even if you don't need it, why not just use the smartest autofocus mode? I probably wouldn't recommend it if you're shooting objects, because when it comes to objects, they're not really moving. For something like that, I would just set my focus, lock in my lens, not have the focus move around. Honestly, I probably wouldn't even use autofocus for still life, but autofocus is very important, and it's important to pick the autofocus mode that is right for you. And if you guys are wondering which autofocus mode would be right for you, if you're doing still life, I would use single shot. Zone AF I'm actually not a fan of, and I pretty much never use it. But if you're shooting people, use the tracking face mode. It's amazing for people, but I generally tend to stick between either tracking face mode or just 1 point. Spot AF is not that useful. Zone AF is not that useful. Those two are really my go-to modes. Next up, we're gonna look into drive modes, which is how fast your camera can shoot. So basically, we're still in the same menu. Just hit this little square right here, and you'll see drive mode. Now, you have a bunch of options. Now, if you go into H, high-speed continuous shooting, this thing will turn into a machine gun. And you don't always want that, because you'll end up with way more photos than you need, and you'll be shooting faster than you can really keep up with. So depending on how fast you want to shoot, this camera does shoot really fast. Do a couple of tests, see which ones you like better. But setting up your camera for drive mode is the best. Single shooting is, of course, just a single shot. High-speed continuous shooting, that's super fast. Low-speed continuous shooting is usually what I use for tracking objects. And then some of my favorite modes for this is self-timer mode, where it'll literally take a photo after 10 seconds or take a photo after 2 seconds. I'd like to use self-timer mode a lot because, believe it or not, I sometimes take photos of myself. And it's easy to just set up the camera, pose a little bit, and take that. Especially if you're like an influencer that has to shoot themselves a lot, this is a really, really good photo mode to use. And for the most part, if you can nail those three things with photo mode, you're pretty solid. Make sure you're well versed on how shutter and aperture works, but if you can get those three things right with photo mode, you're gonna get very good images out of your camera. All right, guys, so next up, we're gonna talk about the video features in this camera, which is actually the thing that I'm most excited about because this is such a good video camera. So the first thing you want to do is you want to flip your knob from photo mode to video mode. And once you're in video mode, you'll get a very different menu. So if you want to hit your menu button again, you'll notice that right off the top, instead of image quality, you'll see movie rec quality. Rec is, industry talk for record. So once you go in there, you'll actually notice you have a bunch of different options. So right up there, movie record size, you want to hit that and you'll get a bunch of options for 4K, full HD, or just regular HD. Now you don't want to pick regular HD because what Canon calls HD is actually 720p. I call that antiquated. I know I use a big fancy word, believe it or not, I speak a bit of English. But depending on what you guys want to shoot, so this specific camera shoots only in IPB, which is not a professional codec, but it should be fine for most of us. So you can pick 4K in 30 frames per second or 23 frames per second. Now, really depends on what you're doing. I recommend 30 frames per second if you want to just be able to slow down your footage just a little bit, but not a lot. Or if you're shooting for TV or some kind of documentary that specifically needs to be 30 frames per second, most of us will definitely be shooting at 24 frames per second or 23 frames per second, however you want to say it. So now if you want to shoot in 4K because you know you're shooting in 4K for a reason, go ahead and pick 4K. Otherwise, for most of us, the HD in this camera is wonderful, it's sharp, it's detailed. I love Canon cameras for their HD capabilities. I tend to lean towards Canon whenever I need to shoot HD. I think the HD and the color science out of this camera is way better than the Sony's. I wouldn't say I'm a Canon fanboy, but I just know quality when I see it. So go ahead and shoot 60 frames per second if you want a bit of slow motion, 30 frames per second if you want just a tiny bit of dreaminess if you slow it down, but most of us will probably be shooting in 23:9:8, which is 24 frames per second and is real time. But for those of us who do want to shoot in super slow motion, because this camera does do 120 frames per second, go back into your menu and you'll see high frame rate. Now, if you forgot how to get there, just hit your menu button again, go to movie record mode, and right outside of movie record, before you go into the 4K option, you'll see high frame rate. Now hit the high frame rate and it will enable this. Now the key thing to remember is once you're in high frame rate mode, your camera will only shoot in 120 frames per second. So you don't want to be in a situation where you think you're getting audio, you think you're getting regular video, and then you just end up with this slow motion clip. It tends to happen to the best of us. Be very, very careful with that. But if you think you want slow motion and you don't want to have the hassle of switching back and forth, I recommend just sticking to 60 frames per second in full HD. But once that is enabled, you can start shooting and you will get 120 frames per second. A quick thing to note when shooting slow motion, make sure your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So if you're shooting 120 frames per second, make sure your shutter speed is at least 240 frames per second, if not higher. I tend to shoot about 320/1 for my shutter speed because I want it to be really, really sharp slow motion. But a lot of that depends on your taste. And if you're gonna do slow motion, make sure to pick something that has a lot of movement, has a lot of interesting things happening, because otherwise you're just seeing this one thing move super slowly and it gets very boring very quickly. Another thing to note about the slow motion capabilities of this camera is that once you go into slow motion, the autofocus does not work and the audio does not work, which is totally fine because you don't really need audio for slow motion. Otherwise your audio would just be like really, really slow and low. So you don't need audio. Also, you don't need autofocus, mainly because if your camera tried to rack autofocus during the slow motion take, all you would see is something go out of focus, into focus, very, very slow. It would look very, very distracting. When it comes to slow motion shots, you should really be picking your own focus. If not, just setting your focus to one thing and keeping it there. I tend to shoot slow motion at really high aperture, like f8 or f9. But sometimes it can look really cool if you have a static image at like a very shallow depth of field, like an f2 or an f1.4, and just you have something move in a really shallow depth of field. That can look really interesting, but slow motion is a tool, you just have to get creative with it. Now the next thing I want to talk about is focus modes and manual peaking. Now what peaking is, it's a tool that's used to catch focus easily when you're doing manual focusing, but I'll explain more of that as I get into peaking. So the first thing you want to do is you want to go into your camera menu and let me just get it right over here. So once you're in your camera menu, go to the 4th page and you'll see autofocus method. Now, as we talked about autofocus methods earlier in the photo section, you've got zone, 1 point, spot. I prefer tracking just because, especially with video, I'm moving around a lot. I want to be able to track faces. Nothing's really changed from the autofocusing part. But next you'll see is manual peaking. So sometimes you want to be able to turn your autofocus off. Depending on what you're using, you can just look to the left of your Canon lens and there's a switch next to your lens that will just say off. And if you're using a non-Canon lens, it should still be there. And if you're using a manual lens, you don't even have autofocus to begin with. So right there, if you go into your menu and at the bottom of camera menu, page 4, you'll see manual focus peaking settings. Hit that and you'll see peaking. So first you want to turn the peaking on. And next you want to go to level. Now level could be high or low. I prefer it, and now high or low doesn't mean that'll show, it just means how intensely it shows you peaking. It doesn't really affect what's in focus or not. I prefer to keep it at low because otherwise I find peaking looks really distracting and can sometimes skew how I feel about the image. So I prefer to keep it low, but depending on what you're doing, maybe if you're in a tough focusing situation, maybe you want to keep it at high so you can really tell when peaking is hitting or not. I tend to keep mine low. A lot of people like to keep their peaking color at red. I personally don't like to use red because I shoot a lot of people. Most of my work is fashion and shooting people, and the red really tends to clash with people's skin tone, and then I can't really tell if the skin tones are coming out right, so I tend to use blue. I find blue is the color that really helps me figure out how skin tones are looking without having to turn my peaking on and off. Yellow I wouldn't recommend just in general. I feel like yellow's such a faint color to look at, but blue is my go-to, and give it a shot. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, but I genuinely think this blue and low is the best way to go with this camera. And last but not least, I want to quickly touch upon this. It's not necessarily a tutorial of what sort, but I want to make sure I give you guys some idea of best practices on how to use this camera best. Now, if you go back into your live view mode, you'll see this menu right here. And right here at the bottom, you'll see ISO. Right now I have my ISO set to auto just because it is. It's really important to make sure that you have your camera at a healthy ISO depending on your lighting situation. Now, the way this camera works is a little bit, Canon does a really good job with the way they balance their colors. They do a really good job with their ISO. So a lot of cameras, the lower you shoot, the cleaner the image will come out. And that is true for this camera especially. It's a little bit different on the mirrorless line, but we'll talk about that in a separate video. Generally, I find I like to not keep it too low because sometimes when you have it very low, you'll tend to clip shadows or clip highlights depending on what you're shooting. But usually you end up clipping highlights if you have a low ISO. So I usually like to shoot no lower than 400. I find 400 is a nice healthy balance. I'm not clipping anything. I still get very good dynamic range. And when it comes to the high end of your ISO, I would probably never go past 3200. 3200 is probably the place that I wouldn't want to go past when I'm shooting people. Now, it's different if you're shooting landscapes or objects because modern noise correction is so advanced, where if I was shooting like a landscape, honestly, I wouldn't even have a problem going to 12,800. The camera does a really good job, and you can really just wipe a lot of that away with noise correction, simply because when you look at a person's face and there's noise in the skin and you remove that with noise correction, what generally tends to happen is you'll get really bad skin tone and their skin just doesn't look beautiful. You can just tell there's something off with it, or it looks too smooth. But when you're shooting buildings or mountains, no one's looking at a rock being like, that rock looks a little too smooth. No one's really looking that close. And especially when you're doing wide shots, it's just not gonna be relevant. So 12,800 for landscapes wouldn't even be an issue with a good noise corrector. But for people, I probably wouldn't go past 3200. 6400 for just everyday objects and maybe some documentary work in a pinch is totally fine. I personally love to keep this camera at about 800 to 1000. I find most situations, I'm not always in low light situations, but 800 gives me really good dynamic range, and it lets me play in a place where I don't need to push a ton of light into my image. 800 and 1000 is a very good sweet spot, and that's the place that I recommend most of you guys operate in as well. Because also a lot of times if you shoot at too high of an ISO, even though your image looks clean, often I find what you're doing is you're not putting enough light in, and your images in post-production will look underlit. And you don't want to go to a production company or director you want to work with and for that person to look at your image and be like, I feel like you just cranked up the ISO. I wish you had more light in there. So generally I find 800 is a very, very good place to have your ISO, and a lot of digital cameras play at 800 ISO. And from there, you have a really healthy base to add light or take out light, and you can really get creative with your cinematography. I hope that wasn't too much of a ramble, but ISO is a weirdly important thing with cameras. And a quick side note, I shoot on 2 RED cameras, and I tend to keep mine at about 800 to 1000 ISO as well. Now, the next thing I quickly want to touch upon is just to show you guys the time-lapse mode. I really appreciate the fact that Canon does time-lapse modes in most of their cameras, and this camera tends to be a bit more robust than the others. So first, you want to go into time-lapse mode, which is operate camera menu 1, page 1, right there, time-lapse menu. What you want to do is you want to enable it. And once it's enabled, you just want to pick scene 1 or whatever. And these scenes are actually already set up for you, shooting moving objects such as walking people, slow moving objects, slow moving objects, medium moving objects, fast moving objects. So whatever you want to do, and you can also make a custom profile for yourself. I won't go too into detail on how to set up a time-lapse just because I think that should be a separate video. Time-lapse is pretty specific to most people. A lot of people don't even shoot time-lapses, but I just want to quickly show you guys how to get to it and that it is available to you. All right, guys, so we've been talking a lot about video, and there's 2 things that you absolutely have to nail when it comes to video. One is your picture profile, second is your audio. So let's take a look at our picture profile first. So if you hit your menu button and you go into camera menu, page 3, you'll see something called picture style. Now you have a bunch of options to choose from, and depending on what you're shooting, it really shouldn't make too much of a difference. You could probably leave it on standard. Once you kind of go into standard, hit the info button and you'll be able to go in, dial in your sharpness, contrast, saturation, color tone. And that's all like fun and dandy. But if you're gonna be shooting something that's for professional work, something that may need a bit of color grading, I'd go all the way down to faithful or to user defined and start tweaking this profile in a specific way to be able to give you an optimal image. So what I like to do is I'll go down to, there's actually 2 methods to this. So one, I'll go down to user defined 2 because I have CINESTYLE on the first one, which we'll talk about shortly. Info, and then here what I like to do is for sharpness I like to go all the way down to -2 or honestly 0. Some people like to hit 0, some people like to kind of keep it in the middle. I like to just go 0, and that way I can always add sharpness later, but I can't take it out. And also I feel like the softness kind of lends to a more cinematic image. Contrast, now you don't want to take out all your contrasts. I tend to do -2. Saturation, -2. Color tone, never touch your color tone unless you know you're doing something specific with it because it tends to move your hues around. Leave color tone exactly how it is. Canon has beautiful color tones. And when you go up to picture style right there, make sure you have this set to neutral. It will just give you an overall flat image. And this is what is known as ProLost. And this is what most people use as ProLost. This is my version of ProLost. I guess I might be tweaking a setting here or there, but this I find works very, very well for me. I'm just gonna do these settings again. But the other better way of doing it is something called CINESTYLE right there. If you notice in my profile setting 1, oops, it's going out of focus. Sorry about that, guys. I hope most of that was in focus. What you'll actually notice is user defined 1 is CINESTYLE. And if you actually go look at the video review for this, I did a review that's Canon 90D video specific review. Make sure you guys check that out. I actually teach you guys how to install CINESTYLE. It's a bit of a pain, but it's about a 10-minute process, 15 minutes max, unless you have like slow internet. But even then, it's not a very big file. But yeah, once you go in there, CINESTYLE is what I use. CINESTYLE actually is made by a post-production house in LA. I believe it's, is it Deluxe or is it Technicolor? No, it's definitely Technicolor. They do all the big movies like the Avengers, Batman, all that good stuff. It's a specific file it's a specific profile that they use on Canon cameras for when movies or TV shows bring Canon footage to them. Definitely recommend looking into CINESTYLE. If you just do a quick search for Canon CINESTYLE, it comes up. It's pretty easy to install. But I definitely recommend checking out the video specific review of this camera. Also, if you guys have any questions, if I left anything out, hit me up in the comments down below. Always happy to answer questions. You guys are literally the most fun thing I do with my life. I love answering questions and just like chatting it up with you guys in the comments. All right, guys, so last but not least, audio. So if you want to go into camera menu 1, page 1, you'll see sound recording. You want to go into sound recording, and it'll probably be set to auto, but you want to set it to manual, or you can disable it altogether. It's really up to you. Maybe you don't want audio in camera, don't want people chatting away and having a client hear it. But once you go into record level, you want to actually set this fairly low. Like now, right about here, I want to make sure my finger lines up. You'll see 12. Now you want to make sure you can get that fairly high without clipping past the 12. The thing with a camera like this is the DSLR and the preamps built into the camera are very, very just mediocre. So if anything clips past 100%, or if anything peaks in your audio, that is just lost. It is not recoverable. I would rather have my audio be too low and then bring it back up and clean up a bit of noise. Or what you guys can do is, I bought one of these. This is only about 120 bucks. It's a Zune recorder where I'll have my mic go into this and then go into the camera. So I always have a second audio that I can sync up from here. The preamps in that thing are great. So anyways, you want to go into record level and make sure it's fairly low. I usually leave it about here, but depending on your environment, you want to have something else. This is just something I really, really wanted to mention because a lot of times I find people are just blowing the audio with Canon cameras. They're amazing cameras. The audio's kind of mediocre. If you really want a Canon camera with really good audio, I'd look into the C Cinema series, which is like generally about a $6,000 to $10,000 camera, but very, very worth it. And lastly, you want to go into wind filter and you want to make sure this is off. Attention, just everything off. You want to keep your audio just basic and just let your post sound guy work with it. Well guys, that wraps up the tutorial on the Canon 90D. This is a fantastic camera, but today we just went over the top line stuff. So if you guys have any other questions about this camera that are more advanced, hit me up in the comments down below and I'll be more than happy to answer them. If not, make an entirely new video just on your questions. Last but not least, there is a link in the description down below for this specific camera with the best pricing, so be sure to check that out. And also, in my professional life, I'm a cinematographer. I shoot a lot of fashion, music videos, and I want to start sharing a lot of that work with you guys here on this channel. We're going to be talking about more industry stuff, how to make it in the business, more technique-based stuff. So if you guys are interested in that, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. We'll be talking a lot more about that stuff this summer. And if you guys have any suggestions for future content, let me know. Until next time, guys.